The title of this paper was an attempt to get into something that I was grappling with as an art historic and working in a university. I do not have my own collection. I do not have an archive. So I wanted to continue a project I started in 2013 on the Norwegian sculptor Åse Teksmann-Rygg, who was active from the beginning of the 50s and all through her life until she died just a few years ago. When I approached the 1950s women artists, and when I read about her, it's perhaps not very surprising. She seems like a lone figure in Norwegian art history. She was a pioneer of abstraction. And then when you go around, you found a lot of these lone figures that are integrated into art history, that figure in the exhibitions, but are not really read as part of the history of having agency. And when I read my way through literature, you also read through different paradigms of feminism, of art historical studies, and a lot of about the 1950s came back into Norwegian art museums in the 1980s, which is when the biographies of a lot of women artists were written, including Åse Teksmann-Rygg. So you somehow get the stories from the 1980s looking at the 1950s that are filtered into the, we could say, 2010s when the National Museum was making this exhibition in 2014. And it's been a journey that's been kind of, I should go back to my manuscript or I'll talk too long. I thought I would find a lot more than I did find when I started reading in the archive or reading the newspapers. I thought there would be a lot of information on many of those women artists. There is a lot of information, but very little art criticism written on them. A lot of information on where they exhibited, but the threads are very difficult to piece together, at least from my perspective, and it requires a lot more archival work. So I haven't gotten there yet. The picture I put up as my opening picture is a picture of the former secretary Ingse Korsberg. She was the former secretary Ingrid Korsberg and the secretary of Oslo Kunstforening, Marie Skottrud, who are standing in front of a painting by Else Hagen, Norwegian painter. And this is an image from an exhibition in 1949 that they do not know exactly what exhibition it is. And as you can see, one of them has a cigarette in her hand, and they're obviously discussing and looking at this painting. Else Hagen is one of the pioneers on the threshold of the 1950s. She had made important reliefs in the Oslo Town Hall that had just opened. She is represented with a large decoration or a large artistic piece in the parliament, and she's made a large number of other reliefs in schools and in public buildings. One of the stories about Else Hagen is also that when the Norwegian artist Henrik Sørensen tried to donate one of her works to the National Galleries, they threw him out. In a frenzy, and he said, why don't they want to take in this wonderful artist? So what grappled me with this image is somehow, and it does perhaps not seem surprising to anyone, is that there are two women standing in front of a painting by a woman discussing it, and I didn't know of any of them before I started digging into all of this. And I found it fascinating. And here you can see Else Hagen's decoration in the Norwegian Parliament, where you go up the stairs. And if you read about her, and a lot of the women I was tracing, when you start, you just read the biography articles. It's also interesting to see how they are narrated and how they are visualized. Because in the case of Else Hagen, what you can see is a small graphic piece of hers showing sisters, because she was interested in women's issues. And what she, in the article in the Norwegian biographical paper, but what she did and what she saw as her main project was not the graphics about sisters and the feminist work, it was the large installations that you can see here, that she spent 30 years on ladders with stone, glass, and metal in her hands. Else Hagen is, in Norwegian art history, seen mainly as a threshold of someone who was from the old regime going into the 1950s. And the main artist that I was looking at in the 1950s, although Else Hagen was active, are the ones who were the pioneers of abstraction in a Norwegian context. Few of them you see here, the ones that are most well known: Åse Monrygg, the Norwegian sculptor who was the first one to exhibit abstract sculpture in Norway in an exhibition in 1952. You also see Anna-Eva Bergman, who participated in a lot of exhibitions in the 1950s, lived in France for large parts of her life, so she didn't enter Norwegian art history until the 1980s, seriously. Inger Sitter, you see an early work by her from 1955. She is one of the huge and very, very famous women artists in Norwegian art history, and she's had a real unique position. And the other two, those three are fairly easy to trace. A lot has been written about them. And then I thought I would find a lot about Gudrun Kongolf and Gunvor Advokat that you can see, but trying to trace them is much more difficult. But they all exhibited abstract paintings and sculpture in Norway around 1950, at a time when abstraction was frowned upon. And at the time, about 30% of the women in the Høstutstillingen and in the exhibitions were women. Women were also on the boards, 25 to 30% of people on the boards deciding what art would be exhibited. But there's very little trace of them in art criticism. Approaching their careers, I often rely on the quote that I have placed before you, that you probably know. The complex relations between painting or art, feminism and history can be rhetorically tracked in the contradictory placements and significations of two bodies: the body of the painter, who can inhabit the body of the painter, and the female body. We know that they negotiated their place in the world, and if I can't find them spoken in the archives, how do I speak them? How do I negotiate their bodies and reinsert them into art history? What would the 1950s look like if we tried to take and imagine not just the position of the struggling woman producer trying to write her life, but also write or read women as parts of networks where women were both producers, readers, curators, and writers of art? I would like to in my study that I'm doing, take the position of a desiring feminist subject, trying to read what is the prehistory of my present, making them, of course, pioneers of a feminist history that hasn't really started much yet, but is still there in the 1950s, trying to discuss how they interfere in and are at odds with or fit into a discourse of abstraction at the intersection of gender and national identity. National identity somehow seems far-fetched in this context. The project of all these artists was far from national, perhaps apart from Anna-Eva Bergman, who was fascinated by Norwegian nature. The women that I have chosen as examples are not the ones that continued the ongoing focus of on landscape and the local scene, but the pioneers of abstraction who turned towards the international scene. They are competing, as they do this, they are competing in a field where masculinity is discursively connected to nationality by reference to the expression and the sensibility to landscape inscribed in the traditional role. Women's bodies are caught at the outskirts of the discourse of national art history by being either too embedded in the national narrative, they're too provincial, too local, and hence not interesting as part of an avant-garde, or too international, and not able to relate to the nation and their needs. In the play of reference, deference, and difference, they seem to be lacking in Norwegian art history. So, my start was that I wanted to follow up an essay that I wrote in 2014 for the solo exhibition of Åse Monrygg at the National Museum of Art, Architecture and Design, where the curator was Randi Gode. So I didn't have anything to do with the curating, and she asked me, couldn't we do something about gender with Åse Monrygg? It was a large retrospective exhibition, and in this picture you can see sort of the two parts, the beginning and the end of Åse Monrygg's career. And she is one of the artists that, the grand old dames, that she got her recognition at the National Museum of Art at the age of 89. Although she had previously had a retrospective exhibition in 1992 at the Naiskunstnikud Kunstcenter, and Øyvind Storm Bjerke had written her biography in 1982, and it came in a revised version in 2010, she seemed to be in this group of grand old ladies who only after the year 2000 were granted some kind of recognition. She was also exhibited at Documenta in 2012, like Hanna Ryggen and other of those artists of that generation who really came to fame after 2010. And the problem with Åse Tegsmann-Rygg was that when she started her career in 1952, most critics were very critical about abstract sculpture, especially, but also abstract painting. She received good reviews, but was never really recognized and was not allowed to be a member of the Association of Norwegian Sculptors in the 1950s. So the huge question in the biography of Åse Tegsmann-Rygg and for everyone is was she excluded because she was a woman? Was it because she was a woman that they didn't accept her, or was it because she was too radical? And as you can see, I've included a quotation of something that happened in a discussion with her husband. She was married to a designer. And at the opening of one of the Høstutstillingen in the 1950s, he was talking to one of the jurors at the Høstutstillingen about sculpture, who then said to Åse Tegsmann-Rygg's husband, "I'm skeptical about abstract sculpture in general. I am fully aware that your wife's sculpture are better than the average when it comes to," I'm sorry about the errors of typing, "comes to what is shown at Høstutstillingen. But to accept her works, we would have to ask more of her than of other sculptures. If we let her in, we have to accept a whole new artistic tendency in sculpture. If one way we have to accept her, she has made truly great sculpture." It doesn't give us very much, like most of the reviews, they don't say very much about gender, and it's not obvious that the problem here is her gender. She was the first to work as an abstract sculptor in what was seen as a concrete way, meaning a sculpture that doesn't represent anything or that is about what she called sculpture in its purest form. She claimed herself that she was working or referring to them as sculptura pura. So she's gradually approached as part of a concrete movement as opposed to abstraction or expression that was later became important. The reviews in 1952 were, as you can see, fairly good. They summed up what she did was a gradual abstraction in her art. And Arve Moen in Arbeiderbladet said, "The sculpture tells us that she is wisely and step by step she works towards the mastering of a model form and language of art, and the results are promising." However, she was not included into the Sculptors' Union. It took 10 years before abstract sculpture was really launched and accepted on the Norwegian art scene, according to traditional narratives. So she exhibited all through the 1950s in small scale, taking part in international, in a British, what do you call them, konkurranse? Contest for monuments, but never in Norway. The war monuments in Norway were all figurative at the time. It took 10 years before abstraction really was the breakthrough of Norwegian art. And then it came with the so-called father of Norwegian abstraction, Jakob Weidemann. And as you can see here, they work in a very different language of art. Did I say Weidemann? I mean Arnold Haukeland, sorry. He is often mentioned in connection with another abstract painter, Jakob Weidemann, who is the father of abstract painting. And they had an exhibition together in 1961 that was really seen as the beginning of the true acceptance of abstraction in Norway. They travel in pairs. He is often mentioned along with Inger Sitta, who is one of the female artists who have been really, really accepted in Norwegian art. She started her career in the 1950s working in abstract painting, as you can see here, and developed further on later towards painting more landscape or painting stones from landscape from the 1960s and onwards. Sitter is amongst the women is not difficult to trace. She is one of the women who's been highly visible in Norwegian art history. She's held a number of important positions in cultural life, worked in anything from the Arts Council to being the first professor of the Norwegian Art Academy. So she is what Øyvind Storm Bjerke calls the urkraft in Norwegian art history after the war. She had an enormous impact on the status of abstract painting, but she was also a feminist in the 1970s and 80s, so she can also be seen as a woman pioneer. Norwegian art critics were skeptical about accepting, there were some more images of her working together with Carl Nescher on Regjeringsbygningen. The exhibition in 1961 that is said to have launched abstraction in Norway was at Kunstnernes Hus with Arnold Haukeland and Jakob Weidemann. And this exhibition was replicated in 2015 at Lillehammer Kunstimuuseum, and which is the first time that I have seen, at least seriously, somebody discussing the inherent masculinity of this exhibition and of the critics that it received, and of the ways the artists were launched. As you can see, an important part of the discourse of abstraction, at least if we are to believe Karin Hellandsjø and her biography of Jakob Weidemann, is how abstraction could finally be accepted in Norway when it had reference to landscape, so that it could be inscribed in a long tradition of experience of nature that convinced the public and made abstraction accepted. As you can see, that's also how Weidemann sees himself, but there is also the launching or the association of expressionism that, in a sense, made it acceptable because it is, in that way, an artist that you can recognize. Tracing the exhibitions, there haven't been that many of the 1950s. One important exhibition was in 1998, the Focus 1950, which would shed new light on the 1950s. And the narrative, the canonical narrative of Norwegian art is what you can see represented here, is the repetition of Jakob Weidemann as the enfant terrible. It's the canonical myth. His talents were recognized from the beginning, also by those conservative critics who shuddered at the seeming frenzy that gave form to his artistic gifts. Weidemann's frequent stylistic turnabouts and professional daring early on pegged him as a Norwegian offshoot of the faithless Picasso, in addition to the purely formal kinship with this artist that is also evident in many of his works. In my view, this is the 1960s and the 1990s, looking back, erasing women from the status as pioneers in the 1950s and installing Weidemann as someone with a talent who is allowed to be working all through the 1950s and then flourish in the 1960s. It is not making a good account of what happened in the 1950s when the women were absolutely part of the early phases of abstraction. But what the important thing is that to be inscribed in the Norwegian canon at that time, also abstraction, you have to reference how you saw and felt landscape and how you could continue the legacy or criticize it in a new way as a new artist being in the Norwegian canon. For the women working in more what could be seen as more expressionist ways, this heroic narrative is never accessible. Although they were talented in the 1950s, as we know from their stories, they are never seen as, they're never likened to Picasso, they are never seen as talented as Weidemann, as Haukeland and the others. Even though Inger Sitter was the one that had most of the contacts with American abstract art, she's never seen in the same way as those men who are allowed to negotiate the national and the international tendencies in an expressionist masculine way. And the expressive artists looking at landscape also as a narrative or a topos that comes about in artists who are not really working with anything abstraction from nature, such as Gunnar S. Gundersen, who is married to, in the 1950s was married to Gudrun Kongelf, who is one of the artists that I was trying to trace. He worked in a very concrete way, but still he always inscribed and is inscribed in the narrative of looking at landscape. Gudrun Kongelf, on the other hand, when I was trying to trace her, she's an example of something that becomes difficult. She is always mentioned in a lot of sources, but you don't know very much about her. She is an example of what can be seen of most of these artists, that to find them in the histories of art, that you find them by way of their men. She was married to Gunnar S. Gundersen, she's in all the biographies of him, but there are no traces really of her influence. When she is read in his biographies, she is read as accompanying him to Paris, where they met the Danish artist Mortensen, that he was influenced, she introduced him, her husband, to Mortensen, and then he became influenced, and then Gudrun Kongelf is gone. So she's difficult to find. The things that I can find in public newspapers is that she didn't make much money. In 1957, she only earned 1,935 kroner, which was not enough to live on, so the tax government called her in to have a meeting, which she declined. But some of it can be traced, and I think in some of the interviews where she interferes in the text because she worked together with Gunnar S. Gundersen, you can find traces of the negotiation of the women artists who cannot claim the expressionist or the national identity, but have to negotiate their way. In an interview given in 1953 in connection with an exhibition that she had together with Ludvig Eikås and Gunnar S. Gundersen, the translation was left out. She is asked if she thinks her femininity had anything to do with her art, and if they are different. And then she says, I can clearly see when I have the overview of my works that these images are more feminine than the ones in the other room. She says, so she sort of accepts the question and says, okay, there is femininity in it. But then she continues, but we're all part of the same group, all three of us, and it is about abstraction. So she accepts the femininity question, negotiating her place as a woman artist, but then continues talking about what was her real artistic project, which didn't have anything to do with femininity or with the body or with her own social identity. She elaborates on what abstraction means, how it is a way of balancing tactility, materiality, rhythm, and the expressive quality of color. And then, after doing that, a paragraph of that, she says, but now I've been, nå har jeg visst sagt nok, but now I've been talking enough. And then she hands the words over to her husband. And that sums up how the internalization of the negotiation takes part in her career, that they only pop up in these small instances where you can find them, but you don't really know very much about their program or about their lives. But some of the articles do give us some insight into what she said or what she was thinking about her own abstraction. So, and she names it in ways that are similar to the ways that men would say it. It's exploring the self-recognition. The human consciousness can skip time limitations. So she wants to transcend a transcendent, concrete art, you could say. It's the intuitive sensation of time and space, the contact with the universal, and the forces that are made and ordered in movement, rhythm, and the forces that create and shape them, is what she was working with. But most of these texts, or these small things that are said by the women artists about their own art, are never read as part of the discourses of abstraction in the 1950s. They return in all literature to the individual artist, as her individual project, as her individual work. So the women, as you see them, are inserted as part of a network of other artists and men, but they are never granted a voice, at least is that how I see them. So you find them in images, like Gudrun Kongelf here, working on the mural she made together with Gunnar S. Gundersen and Ludvig Eikås in Nordens Kjemiske Fabrikker in 1949. Or you can see she assisted on the making of the facade of Kunstnerforbundet in 1950. Another woman artist that I've been trying to trace, that I need to trace more, is Gunvor Advokat, who I thought I would find a lot about. She exhibited quite a lot in the 1950s, but mainly you find just the names of her paintings and some criticism. And this is an example of what we all know, that women received rather sometimes neutral criticism, but sometimes rather harsh criticism. The images here by Magne Malmanger, the images tell us that this woman has been traveled widely, but she might as well have stayed at home. And then he goes on and talking about how much she hasn't extracted anything from the local places that she's been to. It's bland, it's all the banal colors, or either she's in Sicily or Norway, it's the same thing. She doesn't have a genius. Returning to Åse Texman Rygg and the biography of Åse Texman Rygg, when I was trying to excavate her artistic identity, because one of the questions that I'm approaching the end, one of the questions that Øyvind Storm Bjerke is grappling with or introduces when he writes his biography in 1982, and that is continued in 2010, is the question, is this a woman pioneer? And he says, well, yes, she is a pioneer of sculpture, but she is not a woman pioneer. And one of the things that he uses, one of the references he has to underline that she is not a woman pioneer, is that she didn't see herself as part of a feminist group. She didn't see her work as having anything to do with gender, and she didn't want to be read in the context of 1970s feminism. Oh, that isn't what he said, but that's the part of it. So her gender didn't have anything to do with her as a woman. No, sorry, with her as an artist. She was mainly frowned upon because she was too early. But if we go into the art criticism on Åse Texman Rygg, we will find all of those traditional ways of characterizing the woman artist. One example in the 1950s, one example is here is making her smaller. He says, this, in one of the critiques in 1952, this is a really young artist who works seriously and with plan. And she's really found the happy combination of spontaneous feeling and sensibility, which are typical of femininity, that she has balanced with organizing intellect. She's sensitive to all impulses and still so logical, so strict. The whole criticism works as a way of negotiating femininity and artistic identity and how she is able to balance this as a modern woman. And she is both primitive and complicated. So this works by the double character of the woman, inserting her into a narrative but still writing her out as this woman on the outskirts. There are also other examples of criticism. The traditional one that we see that she, the problem of decoration, of the decorative. And the decorative was a problem with abstraction at large in 1950s Norway. They saw abstraction, most of the critics saw abstraction as being decorative and therefore as not being important as art. But it seems to be harsher towards the women, who are more often read as the question is raised and then to be dismissed when met with women. And then she's compared, as you can see, to Henry Moore, and it's said that he was influencing her and he had already done what she was doing, so she's not important to Norwegian art history. So she is written out as a singular woman, and when she's reinserted in her own biography, it's a very strange thing to read. They think that she is still a stranger in her own biography. It's as if she didn't have an artistic personality. All those references to gender in criticism are evaded from the 1980s and 2010 biography, so it's genderless. But the problem comes up, and the biography is really works with her professionalism. The problem is that there are a lot of women artists in the biography, but they are written in and written out again. It refers to both Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, but as you're talking about the influence of that style of way of working, only Henry Moore is referenced. And that happens to all the women who come in. They come in, but then they fall back out again. They're only names and they fall out of the story. And when we read on in the biography, you get an image of a very professional woman, which she was. She was not a very expressionist, outward woman like Inger Sitta, but she also comes out as very dull. It seems like the biographer seems she's kind of dull. So once he starts in a small sequence comparing her to Arnold Haukeland, it's as if the text in Åse Texman Rygg's biography can finally breathe, because Arnold Haukeland has all the characteristics of the real artist. He was drunk, he was expressionist, he was working in a big scale, whereas Åse Texman Rygg is constantly insisting on her own professionality and never on her own expression. And this is something that I think happens to most of the ways that these artists are reinserted into Norwegian art history, is as people, as singular artists who do not have anything else but a professional career, but not an artistic genius. And the problem is that you don't necessarily take out the masculinity of the masculine character, you just write them in, and they are not allowed to speak or have influence on anyone else except themselves. It's like the criticism closes in on their individual project. And I think part of this, what I'm grappling with, is to find a way to sort of map the networks, to read them as part of something more. She was perhaps not the one that influenced Arnold Haukeland, and then you cannot write her into a traditional canonical narrative, but she was part of the 1950s that bed the ground for what came in the 1960s. So you have to rewrite the relations and allow the women to get in and to speak their art in the larger context, which I think hasn't really happened in most of the exhibitions or the texts that are written in Norway about the 1950s. So that's my feminist desire, claiming a feminist desire for what? Not for a singular history, but for something that could be part of my prehistory, of women reading women, of men reading women, and women reading men in a larger historical net where we are not repeating, without knowing it, the masculine, expressive national artist. Thank you.